Hi everyone, my name is Agrahara and I'm with Fan and Debate. And today we will be doing a round breakdown on this UBI topic between Lake Highland KS and Nueva TR of Stanford Semis. So essentially, I'll just be going through the video, making pauses at certain times, going over some sort of strategies or interesting points that both teams make. Again, these teams are like one of the top teams in the nation, but obviously this wasn't, their best debate. But also there's things that they could have improved on and things that you can use from what they've used in this video to improve what you're doing with the debate. If you want to learn more, we're going to be posting way more round breakdowns. Also, visit our website where we're going to be doing more workshops in the spring and the summer. So make sure you just tune into that. So I'm not going to waste your time. Let's break down this round. So essentially, the UBI topic is essentially a permanent stimulus where the government gives $1,000 a month plus whatever of money is owed to children. So essentially, that turns out to be $12,000 a month plus $600 per child a month. So the negative team will be speaking first. That's Lake Highland, and the affirmative team Nueva will be speaking second. Okay, let's do this.
We negate the resolution, and our first contention is poverty reduction. America's means-tested welfare system is designed to funnel benefits to the least fortunate. As a result, Locks of Columbia in 2013 finds that welfare programs have reduced the national poverty levels by 40%, affirming.
Okay, so right there is the uniqueness picture. So this is something that in the poverty debate, if it ever gets there, that the neg is going to rely on is this overall uniqueness picture, poverty's gone down. This should be the main point of contention when dealing with poverty in the United States. The ash should be like, no, poverty has stagnated or poverty has gone up, right? Regardless of what happens to the unique link level in terms of how does welfare decrease poverty or how does the UBI increase poverty, the main thing is to assert that poverty is down right now because of welfare, right? And that's the overall narrative that the neg is trying to go for.
Replacing means-tested welfare with universal basic income would reverse this progress for three reasons. The first is by replacing targeted benefits. Johar Ali Benson.
Okay, so this is a very interesting strategy using three different subpoints for this overall poverty contention. Assuming a couple of them are just time sucks or forcing them or their opponent to respond to all three links, being super, super, super tech here. Assuming this is a text panel, this is Stanford, right? So trying to be really diverse so that the first speaker in summary can just collapse and extend to whatever argument they want. So they have way more diversity under a whole functioning narrative. So this is kind of the symbiotic relationship between having a flow strategy where you have three different links, but they're all telling one huge story. That story is how welfare reduces poverty.
2019 explains that welfare programs are uniquely designed to aid the poor, providing targeted assistance for food, housing, and health care. Replacing these development programs with a monthly check will be far less effective. Urzad Forbes in 2019 explains that 11 million American adults lack basic literacy skills. And without the guidance of the current welfare programs, many recipients wouldn't use their dividends effectively. Second is by diluting funding. Because welfare only goes to the poor, much larger benefits can be afforded. Tanner at the Cato Institute in 2013 writes that the median value of a welfare package is around $28,000 a year. A UBI would transfer resources away from those who need it into the hands of those who need it less, as even the most ambitious UBI plans of $12,000 a year would still cut the average welfare recipient's income by more than half. Third.
Okay, so this is the central stock point of the UBI argument. Do benefits go up and down? This is the second layer of uniqueness here that the neg is trying to establish. This is another point where I'm assuming if the AF and rebuttal is going to contest, no benefits go up, right? Doing evidence comparison saying, no, our study is correct because of X, Y reason, which is why benefits are actually going down with the UBI or up with the UBI, right? So there's a lot of layers of uniqueness that control how this story is going to go out. But things like this are really important. It's pretty sneaky to put this in your second link of your first overall contention when it goes to poverty. So let's see how this plays out.
By disregarding families. Means-tested welfare programs are structured to give more generous benefits to single-mother households, as they have greater financial need than single individuals. Bradford, the Institute of Family Studies in 2018 confirms that children living with single mothers are 5 times more likely to be impoverished. And because of this, Goldman and the Pollier Institute in 2016 finds that single-mother households receive up to $40,000 in welfare benefits. By contrast, a UBI definitionally excludes individuals until they are adults, essentially treating a single mother with 3 children as one person. Because of this, Montague John Hopkins in 2018 finds that even the most generous UBI plans, a single parent would still lose up to $19,000 in annual benefits.
So one thing that I think you can point out, or one thing that is really weak with this impact about single mothers losing their benefits, is there's not a lot of uniqueness. Is single motherhood up or is single motherhood down, right? That's really important. And that's something that I think will get muddled, right? So rather than dealing with the whole, oh, does like welfare, do benefits go down? Do benefits go up? Does the cash amount go up? Instead of dealing with the small numbers and engaging in all the evidence debate, right? The simplest way to persuade judges, well, they are telling you that single motherhood is so bad, but if it's gone up in the last 50 years, that means welfare is counterintuitive, right? So all of this link level analysis they're doing is going to get lost or is going to be disregarded if someone can just be like, well, your impact scenario is going the other way. It's actually like really bad in the status quo or the world we live in right now.
Without enough money to access a proper education or even the most basic necessities, these children will be trapped in a cycle of impoverishment with no chance of upward mobility. For these 3 reasons, Roberts of the CBP in 2017 concludes that under any UBI, tens of millions of the poor would end up significantly worse off, and the Roundtree Foundation in 2018 furthers that a UBI would increase child poverty by 60%. Critically, Zeller of the Huffington Post in 2012 finds that low-income Americans get trapped into intergenerational cycles of impoverishment. In a 2016 Columbia University study, found that poverty causes more death than any other leading cause of death in America. Our second contention is a chopping block. Financing a universal basic income would be incredibly costly. Jagger of the New York Post in 2018 reports that in a single year, a UBI of $12,000 per person would cost $3.8 trillion, and cutting existing means-tested programs would only cover 1/5 of the cost.
Okay, so this is your typical funding argument. This is an argument that was used in the Medicare for All topic and unfortunately was used in this topic. I think Stanford was the first tournament where this whole big spending plan proposals were used that teams in public forums were beginning to use. It became sort of the meta to run, right? This whole, oh, let's use the debt topic from like a couple years ago to leverage this, right? It was really effective in that month. And then following this tournament, everyone had answers. This is one of the weaker arguments, but I think the reason why it's being ran in this scenario is because at the time of this debate round, it's a very new argument. So let's see where it goes.
Importantly, Greenstein of the CBP in 2019 explains that financing a UBI primarily through tax increases will be politically impossible, requiring Americans to accept a level of taxation vastly exceeding anything in history. And the World Economic Forum in 2019 finds that a permanent UBI couldn't be debt financed. Thus, the only politically viable way to fund a UBI would be to cut from other forms of government spending. Problematically, foreign aid would be the first to get cut. This is because, according to...
Okay, so they're arguing that foreign aid will be cut. So a lot of things when discussing this politics arguments or arguments that involve the US government is that one side will try to simplify it to get to their impact. The best way to respond to this is to just blow it up with a bunch of small impact indicators, right? Like bringing up small things like oppositional parties, like sometimes presidential powers, sometimes like smaller voting blocks or whatever. Like anything that could just simply mitigate this argument significantly decreases the probability, right? Because as long as there's a minority group that doesn't want foreign aid to get cut, or if there's an external reason why I want foreign aid to get cut, because it's a geopolitical tool. So if you can argue that, I don't know, the lobbyists and the imperialists love like foreign aid, you can say even if it's mitigation, it takes away the probability of this argument, right? Which is why these politics arguments are really, really weak because they rely on so many external factors. So you need to find out what are the external factors in American government that they're just not including here, right? So they just say that debt, it's going to happen to debt because taxes are infeasible, which is kind of a stretch to say that because taxes are infeasible, debt is somehow feasible, and that there won't be a combination of the both.
Of radius in 2017, foreign aid is a single program in the budget that the majority of Americans want to cut, with 60% demanding significant cuts. This is especially likely given that affirming less welfare spending, because Lancaster from the Center of Global Development in 2007 finds that when Americans see domestic spending being cut, support for foreign aid significantly decreases, because foreign aid is seen as trading off the available resources.
And this is where the argument falls apart, right? Again, this is a bunch of external factors. Now they're relying on this whole the American people want it cut, so therefore politicians will get this cut, right? Again, that's a huge gap, right? Because if that was true, then a lot of things would pass right now, right? So they're relying on American people's perception of things to dictate what the government does, right? You need to point out how that's not true. But also, this is a very, very sketchy link chain. So hopefully that this gets responded to adequately in rebuttal.
Ultimately, ranking of Stanford University in 2013 finds that foreign aid has empirically been the first thing on the chopping block in tough budgetary times. Critically, Web Studies Xavier.
Okay. The key word here is tough budgetary times. Again, when analyzing this whole, when you're doing weighing in terms of time frame, they're only getting access to this argument during tough budgetary times, which means during times of recession or times of war, which means their argument is, again, low probability because recessions are once every 10 years. Also, they're probably for a short amount of time, right? There's a lot of mitigation, not only on the link about the cuts, but also about foreign aid specifically, right? Those questions need to be answered, and those things need to be brought up in rebuttal.
University in 2017 finds that since its inception, American aid has provided over 40% of the global population with food and funds, lifting tens of millions of people out of extreme poverty every single year. Budget cuts would thus be catastrophic for the global poor, as Gurma of the University of Nottingham in 2003 quantifies that every 10% decrease in U.S. aid reduces the Human Development Index by 3%, a measure of livelihood that analyzes education, health, and income of the poor. Critically, the IMVA concludes that poverty is the root cause of death in the developing world. Thus, we need it.
Okay, really quickly before we go to affirmative constructive, just a general thesis of the neg. I think the contention 2 seems very, very interesting because of the impact. It's a large scope impact. You can probably access a bunch of weighing mechanisms. But I think in terms of the substance of link and impact contextualization, the first contention is obviously much better. But I think in terms of text rounds, I could see the second contention being gone for, especially because it's a new argument at the time.
Financing a UBI would be politically impossible.
Okay.
The card says permanent UBI cannot be financed with debt. Yeah. That was correct.
So I think they're just exchanging evidence.
$1 a year on said programs.
So let's see.
2018 finds welfare program.
This is the constructive.
Ready? The waiver affirms our first contention is repairing the broken welfare system. Means-tested welfare is failing right now, as despite implementing 79 means-tested welfare programs and spending nearly $1 trillion a year on said programs, President 18 finds the poverty rate has largely hovered at 10% over the past 50 years.
And that's your uniqueness clash.
More specifically, current means-tested welfare programs are failing in 2 ways. First, by disincentivizing work. Unfortunately, most means-tested welfare programs struggle from an employment trap, where individuals near the poverty line are disincentivized from working so as to keep their welfare benefits. Indeed, 10 out of 15 of the Cato Institute finds that the welfare pays more than the minimum wage job in 35 states. Simply put, workers are turning away from more prosperous employment as they see that upgrading their job could sacrifice their welfare and leave them completely vulnerable. A UBI would eliminate that perverse incentive, allowing families to escape the trap of poverty and climb the socioeconomic ladder. These effects are historically proven, as Schneider 17 of USA Today explains that after families were kicked off welfare, they saw their income double in 1 year and triple in 4 years.
Okay, another uniqueness issue here. Same with the neg's kind of impact on single motherhood. Has unemployment gone down? That's also among the poor, right? Because I feel like this is also another argument that just gets like destroyed here. If they just bring up that unemployment has gone down amongst those who are welfare recipients or who are amongst the poor, kind of seems like this argument is counterintuitive. Kind of needs that analysis there or some sort of evidence.
By wasting valuable funds. Welfare puts a dangerous amount of power and funding into the hands of an overly bureaucratic welfare system, which results in billions of lost dollars of funding for America's poorest. Indeed, 1019 of Cato finds that the current system of welfare gives total power to individual states to decide how and where to spend their money, creating a nightmare of unaccountability where every state has different rules and restrictions. In this unaccountable system, dollars are squandered, as Vallis 15, the Center for American Progress, finds that in TAMP, one of the largest immune-sensitive programs for families in poverty, only 25% of funds go towards actually helping those people. In other words, 75% of the $16 billion we spend on this program is wasted. Fortunately, a UBI would put money directly in the hands of those who need it. As Columbino 19 of the University of Turin quantifies that because a UBI is as simple as writing a check, the administrative cost of UBI could be 5 times smaller than immune-sensitive welfare. Overall, the impact of these flaws in our welfare system is millions in poverty. J19, the Washington Post, quantifies that more than 25% of people living in poverty who are eligible for benefits fail to receive them.
Okay, so I think this second link is pretty interesting, although I would like to see it fleshed out. Right, this is a sort of bureaucracy takes away funding argument. I think in actuality it's pretty small, but I think the way you can implicate this argument is like if there's a bunch of bureaucratic costs that get eliminated with welfare, with the UBI, you can sort of cross apply that to the second contention and say, well, if there's less bureaucratic costs, that means foreign aid wouldn't have to be cut because you'd save more money, right? Eliminating these bureaucratic costs allows you to keep foreign aid. So that's an interesting cross application that can be made. It's pretty strategic.
Our second contention is repealing economic growth. A UBI would have a tremendous positive impact on U.S. growth as it puts hard cash in the hands of those who would spend it and stimulate the entire economy. Matthew 17 of Vox warns that the economy generally tends to slow down and struggle when the middle and lower class aren't earning enough to spend and stimulate businesses to produce goods and services. Fortunately, a UBI would give individuals money to spend productively, bolstering the economy. Matthews continues that as the poor and middle class begin to receive their UBI, $2.5 trillion of spending would enter the economy by 2025. The overall result of the UBI would be massive U.S. growth. Zesa 17, the Roosevelt Institute quantifies that an annual UBI of $1,000 would increase economic growth by a staggering 12.56% over the next 8 years.
Okay, the economic growth numbers come in. So essentially, the new wave is trying to link consumer spending being increased to more economic growth. So I think consumer spending is what, 70% of the economy? So I think there's a lot of ground here. I think a lot of weighing that can be done with economic growth because economic growth goes global because the United States is a global trading partner. So this is another argument that can sort of link into this foreign aid impact, which can lead to a lot of complexity in how these teams weigh the argument.
The impact of economic growth is alleviating poverty. As the American economy grows, so do the job opportunities, wages, and standard of living of millions of citizens. Ferrara 14 of Forbes finds that the economic growth of the last century has decreased child mortality by 95% and that the living standards of America's poorest have doubled. That's why Ferrara concludes the economic growth should be viewed as the ultimate solution to poverty. But economic growth also allows businesses to produce more and hire more workers, alleviating poverty via employment, which is why Matthews adds that the economic effects of the UBI stimulating demand will lead to the overall creation of 4.7 million jobs. The impact is also scalar, as Bernstein 11 continues that every 1% increase in GDP creates 1 million jobs. Importantly, Injawadi 16 finds that jobs are the surest and fastest way out of poverty because even if welfare makes sure people have enough food to eat, jobs ensure that people leave poverty and continue climbing the socioeconomic ladder because job experience leads to better jobs. At the end of the day, you're going to be affirming.
So for me, it's a very interesting argument here because I'm seeing just like a lot of like analytics about over speculation of the economy and just like sort of if you go too high, you crash type of analytics. Hopefully, the app has really good front lines to this stuff. And also, I think this argument to me is like the more stronger of the arguments when dealing with entire like constructives. It just has the most true uniqueness. I mean, I don't have their evidence. I'm assuming everyone's evidence is true. So in that case, the impact contextualization is probably really good because if economic growth is going up, all these statistics are probably true. At the time of this recording, economic growth was up. So I think that, but I also think that it's very interesting that consumer spending is guaranteed when people have more money in their pocket. Because if we look at it historically, right, a lot of people just assume that people have more money in their pocket and they spend, and that's good for the economy. But there's a lot of things like asset bubbles and taking on more debt, right? If I have a small amount of money, I may put a down payment on a car. That's more debt for me. That accumulates a debt bubble, right? Those are analytics that are very, very true. And teams don't think about that because like that part of the economy is kind of like shrouded. People don't want to deal with the realities of what happens when people get more money in their pocket. So let's see if cross is above so. Or if they're going to fall for more cards.
How much money is lost to bureaucracy every year?
25%.
Oh, that's of one program, right? So I'm talking about the entire welfare.
So so first, our balance evidence isolates one welfare program tells you use 25% of the overall administrative cost. This is like a three-part answer. This is important because your third argument about single mothers is dependent on this program. So let's put off as rust. But third and more importantly, the Columbino evidence does a comparative and tells you that UBI has 5 times smaller administrative costs than any welfare program, which means that UBI is always a preferable solution to welfare, even if welfare isn't that inefficient.
The reason you're avoiding my question is because there's extremely small amount of bureaucracy that occurs, right? The only evidence you give is 25% of a single program. There's still tons.
Look, I think that this is sort of a waste of time question. Like there are no lay judges here, or if there are, looks like they're flowing and taking notes. They're pretty engaged in the debate. I highly doubt that this bureaucracy argument will come up any time after the first rebuttal speech. But what I think should happen here is this economic growth argument makes a huge leap from more consumer spending to higher and more sustained economic growth. That should be the first question that comes out of the neg. Is like, how can you guarantee that this consumer spending leads to long-term economic growth, right? How does consumer spending work? In what ways do people spend their money, right? If I give someone $1,000, they buy something that's worth $8,000 because they put a down payment and use debt, right? Use a payment plan or something, right? Or do they buy something that's within their means, right? How does consumer spending work? How does consumer habits work? Those are like small analytical things that can just blow up the entirety of the C2 with just small analytical turns, just saying asset bubbles, right? And then because of these concessions, like I feel like this question goes nowhere.
That don't have a tiny bureaucracy, which is why there's only a few $billion lost to bureaucracy each year. The budget for welfare is hundreds of billions of dollars. So I'm confused what your terminal impact is if only a very small percent is lost to bureaucracy.
I just answered it 3 ways. 1, UBI will always be competitively better than the current welfare system. 2, and more importantly, we actually give you the evidence from specific programs that tells you 25% of rural funds are wasted. I have a question. Sorry, 75% of funds are wasted. I have a question.
Yes.
Let's talk about your third argument about family. The first argument tells you that means-tested welfare gives more money to single-mother households, but then the second card tells you that children living with single mothers are 5 times more likely to be in poverty. Doesn't that just prove welfare is not working the status quo?
No.
He said it. My guy said it. The whole uniqueness evidence, their whole narrative about what's the trajectory of single motherhood kind of disproves their argument. My guy's a legend.
As far as people who get welfare are still in poverty.
No. The card that's saying they're 5 times more likely to be in poverty is not like with welfare. It's not like because there's a greater financial burden because they have children. That's why they receive more benefits.
No, the way So your evidence
They're
says.
under excessive welfare.
Okay, so how many children are in poverty that aren't on excessive welfare?
How many children are in poverty that are on means
Because you said your evidence is comparing the number of people in poverty, the non-welfare, to the number of people in poverty in welfare. So how many?
Okay, this is good questioning. He's getting him actually to concede stuff that matter. If he concedes this entire uniqueness analysis that poverty is like going in the wrong direction, he's dealing with all three links. He's dealing with the entire contention with one just analytic of, hey, he just conceded that people in poverty who aren't getting these benefits or who are getting these benefits are still in poverty and actually getting worse.
People in poverty that
I
aren't on
don't know, do you
welfare.
have a number?
I mean, yeah, our evidence says 25% of people in poverty aren't on welfare in the first place. So that obviously mitigates your
Wait, what
impact.
did your evidence say?
25% of people in poverty aren't on
Okay,
any
and
welfare.
we're obviously going to contest that. We're going to say that there are.
Yes, I'm asking you, why are you contesting it? You're saying I'm contesting it. You have to give me a reason as to why you can contest
I
it.
mean, why we're contesting it?
It's like, what's wrong about our argument that makes your argument preferable?
Yeah,
Why
we
should
have,
you
because
win?
we have evidence that indicates from the United States Census that 50 million people are getting benefits from means justice
So
welfare.
how does that contradict all the fact that 25% of Americans
It
who are
doesn't.
in poverty?
It's just disagreements in statistics.
How does that disagree?
Noah's very good at crossfire.
Because you're saying people aren't getting it, I'm saying people are getting it. That's a disagreement. Can I have a question?
Yeah.
Okay, so on your argument about like your second contention about economic growth, so can you explain like how consumption factors in?
Consumption?
Yeah.
So argument is about consumer spending in the United States. So with the UBI, people also have $12,000 more income they can use more disposably, so they can like buy goods and services. It overall increases investor confidence and just gives people raw cash. That's just about
Okay, so this is the virtual medicine. Nag probably going down.
What is this?
It's box 13. The 40%. 40%.
Oh, Fox. Oh, okay.
Begins now. Let's start at the top of our first contention. They say that overall poverty has fallen by 40%, but our more holistic precedent evidence says the number of people in poverty has remained stagnant at 10% for 50 years. Their evidence says relative to some other threshold, it is around the same. That does not matter. The fact of the matter is the majority of people who were in poverty in 50 years ago are still in poverty now. Let's go.
This is where the evidence comparison gets really weird, and this is probably why both C1s are probably going to be a wash, because the judges aren't going to be able to tell the difference between which study is true without calling for it. And I think even if they call for it, they won't be able to determine which is true or not, because the studies will say what they say. So, which is kind of why you need to have some sort of nuance to this argument to poverty, or explain the poverty threshold in case. Just say this is the right metric to use for this reason.
Our first argument about disincentivizing work. We'll concede that fewer than 1% of people are within 10 percentage points of the income line, which means they don't have access to any of their returns because no one's actually affected by these by the disincentive to work. Let's go to our second mention of economic growth. Their first response tells you we have strong consumer demand right now. The real problem is weak business demand. That doesn't change the fact that right now, our Matthews evidence case, you can still inject $2.5 trillion worth of spending into the economy over 8 years and create 4.7 million jobs. It does not matter how strong or weak consumer demand is right now. All that matters is in the long term, we're going to increase it. And our Matthews evidence also says even if it's high right now, in the long run, you're going to see permanent economic stimulus, whereas all of their evidence are short term. So even if consumer demand is high now, when it eventually goes down, we'll still have the same stimulus, which overall lifts everything up.
So it's an interesting time frame weighing. Hopefully that gets extended in summary. Let's see how it interacts with the recovery dissent. I want to see that.
Their second response tells you from Advocate that employers would slash from income. What the UN finds in 2017 is that a UBI would give the average worker more negotiating power. For example, if their worker is slashing their income, they can step away from that job and use their extra UBI money to go look for another job until workers eventually realize they have to pay their workers the employers realize they have to pay their workers the fair share. Their third argument is about investor confidence. They say that investor confidence will return to normal. That's critical because our Narayan evidence indicates it would not be normal. It would be normal at a higher rate. If there's more people buying goods, then investors are more confident in the economy and more willing to put money in those goods. Their fourth.
So far, very efficient front lines. I'm not timing his speech, but I mean, this is so far very clear under a minute. And I think the big thing here is dealing with this, like, first the nonsense inflation dissad, but then the really good recovery dissad. So there needs to be time invested there. Probably reading turns to those disads so you have offense later in the back half.
Basically says this massive turn about inflation, but Zeza 17, the Roosevelt Institute, finds that even if you take inflation at its worst, A, there have been no historical examples of any other UBI causing this, but second, at most, it would be half a percentage point of inflation. Additionally, Zeza also says their story is all about interest rate hikes, but Zeza says with this inflation, he would not forecast any sort of increase in interest rates. Finally, they tell you that in a recession, more people qualify for welfare. They're misrepresenting their argument. What Econ 17 finds is the actual programs that increase during recession are A, more progressive taxation, and B, unemployment insurance. Neither of those are means-tested welfare. They don't access either of those arguments on the automatic stabilizers. Finally, they say a UBI would decrease debt by 9%, but that part is predicated on the assumption that debt would be finite in the U.S. economy. What Tully 18 finds is the U.S. has an essentially infinite debt ceiling because you can always take out more money, and investors are always confident in the U.S.'s ability to pay down its bonds. Let's go to their case. On their first argument about targeted benefits, we would say at best my opponents access keeping people around the poverty line, but they never access long-term growth. We would say that our employment impacts in our case for 4.7 million jobs are always going to be more important in the long run because people can actually lift their families out of poverty instead of the people who are hovering at the poverty line now. Their second argument is about people about people being poor, how the UBI is $28,000. This is completely fake. This number is fabricated altogether. What Alternate 17 finds is the real amount the average person gets from welfare is $9,000. Because it takes the amount of money they spend on welfare and the amount of welfare recipients. That's the real calculation. It's actually less than what a UBI would be. This also applies to a third argument about families, because in our world, the average single mother is getting more than she is now under their world, which is only around $9,000 for the average welfare benefit, especially considering the average calculation uses a single mother, so on net you're making more money in our world. Let's go to their second contention about the chopping block. We have a couple responses here, but all of it centered around the idea of recession. What Econ 19 finds is that if economic growth is permanently higher, as it would be in our world, we are less susceptible to future economic shocks, pushing the entire economy into recession. There are two reasons why recession is important. The first is it affects people across the globe. In fact, what the IMF finds is 900 million people will go into poverty. A, this means if the entire US economy is slumped, then it ends up cutting all the aid benefits that they talk about the fastest because it generates a lot of political change to prioritize the US and not focus on the rest of the world.
I think that's their argument. I think this weighing is really interesting, but I also think it's the wrong way to go about this weighing argument. Like, they're trying to say that, oh, we prevent a recession, which means we prevent the cuts. I think you want to just take this to another whole level and just be like, we increase the economic growth, so we allow for more government spending, which means if we improve the quality of life domestically through economic growth, there's no fear that, or there's no perverse incentive to cut foreign aid because people are more happy. They're seeing their quality of life improve. They're less likely to be like, oh, we don't want foreign aid. They're not helping us if, they have a more positive outcome from this. So I think that's the level that they should be attacking the perceptual level of what Americans believe and how that influences policy change, rather than dealing with this recession scenario that honestly has such little ground. Like, sure, okay, you prevent recessions, but they could always say during tough budgetary times, which means, hey, if there's a more fiscally conservative president into power that wants to make a lot of cuts, foreign aid is off the chopping block, regardless if we're in a recession, and Americans are more likely to support that. Right, so I think this weighing is at best, this goes in sex and summary. I think there needs to be more link level responses on why Congress wouldn't cut foreign aid or why they're completely simplifying American government and American politics.
But second, recognize if the U.S. economy is growing, the positive effects will spread across the globe. Aurora 05, the IMF finds a 1% increase in economic growth for developed countries leads to a 0.8% increase in the developing world. We would say you're always preferring our growth arguments because if countries are lifting themselves up, it's automatically going to lead to a more sustainable long-term solution versus when aid does get cut in the long run, those countries are going to have nothing to rely on and they're just going to fall back into the greater poverty they were before.
So I think this is going to set up the whole weighing debate is foreign aid better than economic growth? If the United States giving them actual food, water, infrastructure better than just countries using economic growth and trying to bring themselves up, which is pretty hard to argue if you're for the F in this situation. Like, there's this like general thesis that if economic growth happens, countries are just gonna boom, snap of a finger, they're already developed. Like in reality, like for example, if we look at the West African urbanization topic that happened in February, West Africa has positive growth rates, right? Even prior to COVID, they had positive growth rates. Their poverty level stays stagnant, their development stays stagnant, right? So it's very, very difficult to say if we win economic growth, we win the link into poverty, which is something that the neg should be hard contesting. And anytime you hear economic growth solves poverty, you need to be attacking that and being like, well, no, it doesn't. That argument is true, then that means like Africa should be seeing massive poverty declines right now. But the fact that their poverty level is stagnating, it's obviously not true. There's some sort of thing that blocks economic growth from leading to poverty. And those need to be like sort of probability weighing mechanisms or probability warrants, for example, corruption or whatever, need to be used there.
We're gonna take it back.
Okay. Essentially, we went over the crossfire. Essentially, what I want to see from the crossfire, in second crossfire, again, it's very similar to the first crossfire, except you want to be focusing on your case, focusing on the response that they put on your case, rather than going to their case, allowing them to explain more of like their arguments and try to flesh them out. Your case is always more important to focus on that first. Let's zoom ahead to the summary speech.
That would increase under UBI. They try to. Is that one ready? They try to turn our first contention by saying the benefits they receive right now are around $9,000 that would increase under UBI. But their evidence from 2012, the University of Michigan redoes their analysis in 2019 and finds that the average recipient of means-tested welfare is around $21,000, which means that in the app world you're decreasing the income from means-tested welfare that these people get. Go to their second contention. We're winning this round because we explained that to pay for UBI will cost $3.8 trillion, which would force budget cuts. And given that 60% of Americans support cutting foreign aid, this would be the first thing to get cut. The random analysis, which they never respond to, finds that foreign aid has historically been the first thing to get cut in tough budgetary times. The web evidence explains that aid has provided for 40% of the global population, lifting tens of millions of people out of extreme poverty. There are two responses. The first, that in a recession, aid is going to get cut. But the CS News explains that in the 08 recession, aid grew by 80%. There's no link. But their next response is that...
Hold on. Okay, so a big problem here. This is where I think the neg just messed up. They just said during the 08 recession, aid grew. But their entire narrative is that when we see tough budgetary times, Americans want to cut foreign aid because they want to help themselves first. So this doesn't make a lot of sense. This is contradicting your link, kind of. So either it's not a tough budgetary time argument, you're sort of like circumventing this argument to somehow only be the UBI. Because recessions are tough budgetary times, just like adding a bunch of spending to the economy. So hopefully this gets pointed out.
recessions outweigh the foreign aid. Couple of responses. First, the FDER explains that foreign aid allows developing countries to build up their economies and resist future recessions, which means by giving aid, we sell back for future recessions. Second, there's no quantification on their side. You don't know how many people are lifted out of poverty when they prevent a recession, but you know that tens of millions of people are lifted out of poverty every single year.
I think you do. They said 900 million. But I think a better way to go to this is be like, foreign aid is the most direct form of intervention. So on probability, it's probably a higher probability that we lift people out of poverty. On time frame, right, if you build up infrastructure, it's probably going to have a more long-lasting impact rather than economic growth and hoping that the governments of these countries do something with that economic growth rather than helping themselves, right? You need to be reading a lot of probability of like economic growth has to lead from the United States, has to go to another country, it has to manifest in a positive manner because the government then takes that economic growth and reinvests it into the people, right? And then the people use it to increase their living standards. Those are three gigantic steps with a bunch of mitigating and all causes that need to be brought up in probability one. So in any diminishing probability, right? Again, judges are more likely to evaluate probability because both sides are impacting out to massive economic recessions or massive economic, massive economic growth and poverty reduction. So it's about the cleanest link here. So if their link is less probable, the AF wins the round. So I think rather than focusing on, well, does recession happen? Is it important? Not really. That's not the focus. Does economic growth actually lift people out of poverty the same way that foreign aid does? That's the comparison that needs to be made.
Because of United States foreign aid. But third, recessions don't impact the developing countries because they're primarily exporting inelastic goods. That's why the St. Louis Fed explains that Asian and African countries were
Okay, I don't think this is true. Like the 08 recession still impacts the developing world to this day. Like even if they're primarily export commodities, like if the United States sees more people in poverty, that means less goods consumed, they're affected. And especially if they're resource dependent nations, it's also another thing there. This is not a very good warrant. Really doesn't help your cause.
Affected by the 08 recession. Their GDP grew by 50% in the following years. Foreign aid leads to schools, infrastructure, and hospitals that lift people out of poverty in the long term. But fourth, they're linked into a recession that there's more consumption of American goods. Even if you buy this only benefits American businesses and helps American poor. We explained that aid goes directly to developing countries where.
So this is the more direct, indirect approach. This is the way that should have been here and should have been explained like in 5 different warrants in 5 different ways. Just below this weighing up, like rather than making them your 4th, 5th, or judges are probably either not flowing or not paying attention, or you're going. It's going at a decent speed, so they maybe didn't catch it. You say 1st, 2nd, 3rd. This ends the round because even if you believe they win a 100% of their link, you don't know. Like even if the economic growth goes up, they don't win a link into their impact about, reducing poverty, right? Reducing poverty globally because of some sort of probability that economic growth doesn't translate into poverty reduction because the government intervenes poorly.
Much more need of this aid because poverty is much worse in these countries. We're impacting the most dire people. The round is over. But with that, let's go to their case. On their first contention, about welfare being bad, they try to kick out of our terms about how means-test welfare and current work by saying that
I think this is a poor strategy. Like the AF sort of kicks out of this argument, saying that nothing happens. If they kick out of a turn, I think it's more strategic to just let them and then go for turns that are A, conceded, or B, poorly frontlined. Like, if they're kicked out of it, right, it's sort of like you're kind of not really winning a lot of offense here. Because judges are going to be like, well, he conceded the turn, I'm going to buy this, right? Whereas what needs to be happening is going to this economic growth argument and explaining the recovery argument. Where I also think needs, after you've done your work on the C1, you go to the C2, you do what you did there, blow up the 3 weighing mechanisms, go straight to the C2 and say, They talk about automatic stabilizers being 75% and frontline it, saying, well, they dropped the comparative analysis that finds that recessions have decreased by 14 months because of welfare. That ends the round then and there because that links into all the weighing about recessions affecting foreign aid, which just means we have two links into the most important input in the round from their case and our case. It's functionally game over at this point, right? I feel like explaining some nonsensical turn about how more people in the United States, because at this point, the people in the United States in this debate don't matter. It's about global poverty at this point. So winning an impact into an argument that gets thrown out the window doesn't matter. You need to be in the back half, you need to be focusing on terms that link into the best weighed argument possible. So if the term doesn't link in, it doesn't matter. If it doesn't prereq their argument, if it doesn't outweigh on probability or time frame, it doesn't matter. The judge isn't going to evaluate it because it just seems like you just blipped it.
Work cliff doesn't matter. Even if it doesn't exist, we say that mean sets welfare encourages work. They dropped the golden Aadit explains. The mean sets welfare has been reformed to encourage work. Sorry, research shows that welfare increases the amount of work that's being done. They do the weighing for you. Employment is the best way to decrease long-term poverty. We're the only team that structurally incentivizes people to get jobs in the long term. We're winning on their case. On their second intention about global growth. Two turns. First, the voice Aadit explains that UBI increases in consumption, which is going to cause inflation, which forces central banks to increase interest rates, which then would cause a decrease in investment. That's why the Word Evidence redoes all of their studies about GDP growing and finds that.
Okay, so now he's just doing evidence comparison, being like, oh, it just redos the studies. Probably cap. I'm gonna call cap on this one because I don't think that's true. I don't think they have evidence that just redoes all of the AF analysis. So this is where like collapse becomes important. This inflation term doesn't matter. It's probably not a true term. You don't need to go for it. Your first turn on the C1 doesn't matter. The most important argument, and the argument that's handled the most poorly by the AF here, is this recovery argument. They don't respond to it properly whatsoever. So this needs to be the biggest argument blown up on their case. It is round ending at this point. But because you're focusing on terms that don't matter, and you're spending more time on the flow that doesn't really matter, you're not going to see this should have been a clean no decision, 3-0 for the negative here. At this point, if kicks out of the first two turns and focuses analysis on this recovery turn,
GDP would actually decrease by 90%. All the responses about our evidence is bad. Call for it is really good. Then we say that mean sets of welfare acts as an automatic stabilizer. When the economy is doing well, less people qualify for the mean sets of welfare. It cools down the economy. When it's doing bad, more people qualify and injects capital. That's why the Hood evidence explains that while recessions used to occur every 26 months, now they occur every 86 months. They just say that our evidence is not about mean sets of welfare don't act as automatic stabilizers. It does. Call for the evidence. It talks about things like food stamps. This is extremely important because this said the UN explains that the last recession put 90 million people into poverty. We are best mitigating the impacts of recession when they occur. Thus, we need. Can I see 86?
So rather than doing all this really good analysis on how, well, we are winning the best link into recessions, we reduce the amount of people pushed into poverty and the severity and the time frame of recessions. We have a larger link into your weighing on our weighing of foreign aid. We've essentially controlled both sides of the flow. It is game over. And let's have some time to just chat. That instead, you're just sort of rushing on this turn that makes no sense, and you're saying our evidence does the better analysis, which is like all they have to do is like, okay, their turn doesn't matter, call for evidence is good, and just say, hey, send the judge this argument. Let's go to the economic growth argument. But I think this summary was good in terms of it blew up the foreign aid argument, the fact that it's more direct in helping poverty, and that economic growth is indirect. So let's see if that plays a role in the next speech and then final focuses.
My case, my case. So my first intention.
Pause 1 second.
5%. In this summary, they've dropped that welfare has been stagnant over the past 50 years and stayed at 10%. That's a drop precedent evidence. That's really important because what it proves is that welfare isn't actually improving people's overall quality of life. If anything, jobs are the only way to ensure that we have an irreversible chain out of poverty. At that point, let's go to the first argument they make on this turn about means-tested welfare encouraging work. We have considered their response that tells you only 1% of people aren't actually employed, which means none of their incentives work. All of our job impacts clearly outweigh on scope. With that, let's go to the second contention about economic growth. They extended a lot of terms through it here. They don't respond to any of Purnell's front lines. The first term is about increasing inflation, but they completely drop the ZES analysis that tells you that no historical examples prove that American production is high enough to actually cause inflationary spirals. But B,
What I'm saying, all he has to do is just repeat the front. There's no new analysis that he has to read. He's just like, well, they've conceded our evidence. He just says it redoes the study. I don't know what that means. Like, that doesn't mean anything to the judge or this round.
they drop that even in the best case scenario, there'd only be 0.5 percentage point increase in inflation. And first of all, this will trigger any other impact, but it says that concludes will not cause the Fed to change any single policy, which means they don't have access to any other interest rate scenarios. The second term, then they extend this war and GDP evidence, but this completely assumes that debt is finite. They completely drop the utility evidence again here, which tells you that US debt is not finite. We can borrow infinitely, which means none of their analysis applies. The third term, they extend this automatic stabilizers argument, but they completely drop the ICAN 17 evidence that tells you the actual programs that are effective under automatic stabilizers are not means-tested welfare, their unemployment insurance and progressive tax.
Okay, so this is the second place. Again, I think he's just extending terms here. I think he gets a little bit caught up in just, well, they don't really respond to the front line to the two turns, and just says, like, assumes that they didn't do a good job in responding to, because they technically just repeated the third turn. But I think this was mishandled, right? Just repeating this turn won't be enough, because I think the nuance in this recovery turn is really, really good and gets you out of the whole 75% of progressive taxation and unemployment insurance.
Which does not go away in our world. We still solve for recessions better. But second, and more importantly, their own card concedes unemployment insurance is one of the major causes of why automatic stabilizers doesn't work, but for us there. Then you can extend all the offenses conceded. They drop the math return, tells you UBI would increase $2.3 trillion permanently into the economy and raise 4.7 million jobs as a permanent and irreversible economic stimulus in the US economy, which doesn't go away in the affirmative world. But then they drop the British evidence, tells you every 1% increase in GDP creates 1 million jobs, and we're creating 4.5 million jobs, 4.5 million jobs permanently. The Interwadi evidence says jobs are the best way to get out of poverty. It's a clear affirmative ballot insofar as jobs growth is the most important way you're going to be voting on any poverty impacts. Now let's go to their case. At the top, they extend this evidence from Michigan that tells you the people receive $21,000 a year, but we literally read the methodology. It says it's the amount of welfare versus how many people are in poverty. The alternate evidence is pretty clear and telling you that's the wrong way to calculate how welfare is used. The alternate evidence calculates how many people withdraw from the welfare system. It tells you overall that's only $9,000, which means in actual terms, people are making $3,000 more in a world that
Okay, really quick here. So he goes back to this first contention. Ideally, this is what should happen. At this point in the round of the second summary, if they decide to kick everything and go for this one turn, I would be super surprised. But at this point, any argument that you've linked into every argument into poverty, you don't need to be winning these randomized turns. They don't matter because you should be doing really in-depth weighing for why this term doesn't matter. We link into economic growth, we usually link into poverty, we usually link into whenever poverty impacts they read. At the end of the day, who has the best link into poverty? Like, I think this whole, like, oh, they have less benefits or whatever. One, it's not weighed. Like, there's no weighing in this argument. So you just be like, there's no weighing on this argument at this point. You can't evaluate it. Or you always prefer our weighing on economic growth. It's a much, much stronger link to bringing people out of poverty for the reason we just read. Right? Like, in the back half like this, like, these blippy turns don't matter anymore because you have done better analysis on your own arguments that just outweigh theirs, and just do that.
We clearly solve for all their impacts, but now onto the 8 arguments specifically. They drop our turn completely. They just say foreign aid allows. They don't respect the turn at all. Actually, they drop the ICAN evidence tells you econ growth is permanently higher, which is less susceptible to overall international shocks. And the IMF says that pushes 900 million people to poverty. That's their own evidence that tells you the global poor are affected. But anyway, the Aurora evidence functions as its own independent offense because it tells you positive effects of 1% increase in growth in the United States and developed countries leads to a 0.8% increase in in growth in the developing world. That's really important for two implications. The first implication is that that means other countries decrease reliance on US aid, which means when aid inevitably it gets cut in any world, countries can still be sustainable, but B, it allows people to actually grow organically. The impact card comes to their own evidence that we just read, which tells you aid lifts people out of poverty by increasing economic growth. It says aid through economic growth lifts 10 million people out of poverty. So clearly, the most quantified way to increase economic growth is in an affirmative world. There is no evidence that tells you how much economic growth happens in a negative world with aid. We tell you specifically every 1% increase in U.S. growth increases the developing world by 0.8%. It's a very clear of that.
Okay, big problem here. I don't think there's a lot of analysis on direct versus indirect help to poverty. The order in this case should have been like, let's deal with the weighing on economic growth, this indirect versus direct comparison, frontline these silly turns, deal with the recovery argument, go to their case on the link level on chopping block, and use the weighing to kick out of all the other blippy stuff. Because I think they're going to get up there in the next speech, and if you're flowing this argument, if you're flowing around, their third, fourth, and fifth weighing mechanisms are all conceded at this point. That aid is more direct and can help lift people out of poverty and can make them more sustainable for the long term if aid gets cut. So this weighing is like, sure, it's conceded, not really though. The neg does like incorporate that in the weighing. I think it's just grand crossfire here. So let's get to the final focus speeches.
Is everyone ready? We're winning off our second contention about how paying for a $4 trillion UBI would force budget cuts, given that 60% of Americans can support cutting foreign aid. That would be the first to go. The Reagan analysis, which they never respond to, finds that foreign aid has historically been the first thing to get cut in tough budgetary times. The work evidence says aid has provided for 40% of the global population, lifting tens of millions of extreme poverty out of extreme poverty every year. They make this growth and recession response. They do not respond to Max's 6 front lines in his summary. First, recessions do not affect aid. According to CS News, aid increased 80% during the last recession. Second, their evidence about 900 million people going to poverty is just about a global economic shock. Even if they prevent American economic shock, a global economic shock will still happen. So there is no uniqueness on their side. But American foreign aid has uniquely lifted millions of people out of poverty. Third, the FDER explains that foreign aid allows developing countries to build up their economies and resist recessions in the future. They affect one recession, we allow them to recover from every recession in the future. Fourth, there's no quantification on their side. All they do is tell you that growth increases in developing countries. There's a reason they can't read evidence that says that poverty decreases. We're the only team that does that. The kind of growth that aid does is building education, food, like hospitals, roads, like infrastructure, things that actually reduces poverty from the ground up. That's why you know it increases the Human Development Index by 3%. They only say American businesses increase consumption and that leads to exports. It's super.
Okay, so the one big issue here with this final focus is it's like they've considered 6 ways in like all 6 front lines when you only have 2 minutes and you have to extend frontline collapse, extend everything. It's not enough time. Ideally, this comes down to 2 things. One, they have conceded that foreign aid is more direct in lifting people out of poverty. It provides food, healthcare, education that economic growth doesn't provide because governments are corrupt or don't know how to manage their economies and cannot translate economic growth into actual development, right? That's why, the Human Growth Development Index or whatever, you use that as comparative. The second thing is also it takes them out of any recession arguments because foreign aid builds sustainability for those inevitable recessions, which reduces the inevitable recession or the amount of inevitable recessions and like maybe even reduces severity, right? So like rather than reading like all 6 reasons, which are like really silly, you can just group them and expand on them, right? So make them like 2 main weighing points. Even if you grant them 100% of their link, it doesn't matter. They're not linking into the thesis of reducing poverty. Our link is so much cleaner. It ends the round then and there. It's all conceded analysis, which is all true.
There's no link to poverty. Finally, growth does not help developing countries because they import inelastic goods, which is why we say that whether there's growth or whether there's a recession, we import the same amount from developing countries. Imports do not link anything. That's why the St. Louis Fed finds that Asia and Africa increased their GDP by 50% the year after the last recession. Again, foreign aid is long-term, it's structural, and it's always there. That's the first place you vote for us. We outweigh on all fronts on that level. Also,
Again, this was really good. This was all good analysis. Could have been just done in like 30 seconds because you just weed through out everything and just focus on those two central points of foreign aid.
on their case, we vote off the turn. We tell you the Hunger for Democracy tells you that means accessible welfare acts as an economic stabilizer because more people qualify for it when the economy is doing bad and less qualify when the economy is doing good. Our vote is very good. Call for it. It says that unemployment insurance and food stamps have led to the frequency of recessions decreasing from every 26 months to every 86 months. It is very explicit. This turns their argument because even if they help recessions, we make them happen less often. Please call for the evidence. It isolates for accessible welfare.
Okay, this is very silly. I think it's also because he spent like 6 front lines extending 6 front lines that don't make a lot of sense. In reality, he should have extended the weighing. This links back into the weighing about foreign aid. If we reduce recessions, we reduce the probability of foreign aid getting cut, or we control the internal link on their side of the flow, or like their whole economic growth is the key reason to prevent recessions, which prevents foreign aid cuts, right? So instead, you have 2 pieces of offense that round ending. This is what should have happened in summary. This is sort of the roadmap. Go to the C2, extend the weighing mechanisms and the link. Then go to their case. Recovery, if we reduce the severity of recessions and the frequency of recessions, we are also a link not only into their economic growth impact, make implications there, but also a reason why foreign aid is less cut and less often cut. So I think it should be enough. Let's see what happens in the last speech. I think it'll be very close. But Nueva does give very good speeches, so let's see how this goes on.
Alright, start time now. In their final focus, they can see that jobs in the U.S. are the most important impact. We specifically give you the warrant when we tell you that jobs are the only way to lead to long-term climbing the cycle of poverty. Insofar as they have dropped this weighing, it does not matter about the developing world. They agree that jobs are the most important impact. Let's go to how we are creating jobs. Their only our Matthews evidence indicates a UBI would give money to the lower.
But I mean, this is a pretty good speech, like setup. But I think I do really remember, in summary, conceding that dev world matters most, the developing world matters most. So they're kind of going back on here. I think this is good framing, frame the impact on jobs, but I think it's the wrong framing. Like, this is where it's really important, right? You need to weigh impacts a little bit differently. Weighing jobs is fine, but the end goal is reducing poverty in the developing world. Winning US jobs isn't like the best link there. Your best link is economic growth reducing poverty. So the best way to do that is to focus on how economic growth reduces poverty, doing that comparative with foreign aid. So it needs the more link weighing, in the sense you're comparing the links of your contentions to the central shared impact of reducing poverty in the developing world.
Middle class, leading to $2.3 trillion of spending and 4.7 million jobs. And the Bernstein evidence says, the Zesa evidence says, we would see 12% increase in growth, which the Bernstein evidence says every 1% increase in growth leads to 1 million jobs. If you buy that jobs are the most important impact, you're voting after this conceded impact that we create the most jobs in the round. Their only response is that automatic stabilizers operate during a recession. But our ICANN evidence specifically says, isolates that the most effective programs are 2 programs that would not go away if you vote for them. Even if there's some slight mitigation on using food stamps, our evidence specifically isolates the programs that are most effective would not go away. Therefore, we're winning jobs, we're winning the round. But even if you buy their developing argument, developing growth argument, let's really talk about it. Their card says economic aid operates through economic growth, which then lifts 10 million people out of poverty. So the real way you're evaluating the round is who prioritizes economic growth in this round. The way that they prioritize economic growth is by building roads and hospitals. Our analysis is much more quantified and much clearer. We say every 1% increase in economic growth leads to a 0.8% increase in developing world growth. At the end of the day, it's the only quantified increase in economic growth in the developing world, and their own evidence says economic growth in the developing world is key to solving poverty. If you believe their card, which says growth pulls 10 million out of poverty, you're voting for us because we create growth in the US, which spreads to other countries, which eventually leads to overall growth. Their arguments about imports do not matter is empirically denied. Our Aurora evidence says it does lead to growth 8.8%, and they have dropped this. They also dropped two reasons why our growth is better than their aid. The first is other countries are going to develop better for the long term if they're using their own growth instead of relying on other people's aid. So when aid does inevitably get cut, they're going to be left with nothing. But in our world, you have long-term growth, so the countries are always reliant on themselves, not some other outside actor. This also functions with their own case when they say aid is already unpopular. Vote after a long-term solution, both for jobs and the developing countries.
Okay, so that is the run. So if you notice in their final focus speeches, a lot of ballot directive language. And what that means is, even if this phrase is like, even if you buy this argument, it doesn't matter because our argument outweighs for a couple of reasons. Sort of creating the ballot for the judge. I vote for economic growth because it outweighs whatever. Those are, you're basically the RFD that the judge presents to you is what you basically said in final focus word for word. So a lot of setting the narrative, setting the stage for this jobs argument. But I also think that this debate was very, very high level. You have not only debates on the uniqueness level, you have good link development, impact weighing, and links into that weighing. So there's a lot of levels here. But you have to be like aware of just simplify this round. Like there's a lot of complexity, yes, but it comes down to two different things. One, is poverty reduced better by foreign aid or economic growth, and why? And two, like honestly, like does this overheating argument matter? Like, how do recessions impact the round? What is the impact of recessions on this round? So this recession recovery argument and the automatic stabilizers. It comes down to those two questions, right? Which should be the thesis of the back half, but instead gets kind of like frivolous and kind of loosely like mentioned, which is like, why? Yes, both teams are conceding stuff. Yeah, Lake Highland conceded a couple of warrants about why economic growth is good, but Nueva also concedes a couple of warrants on why foreign aid stalls back for the economic growth. So these teams you take away used very structurally sound cases and then got very high level and advanced. But they could have taken it a lot further had they just simplified the debate, which is very, very this is like a very, very simple theme throughout every single debate round. The more complex you make it is only going to hurt you. The more simple you make this round, the more likely you are probably going to win this round. Because now 3 judges have to determine who won this round based on a bunch of evidence comparison and a bunch of analysis that wasn't really made in the round, that they are going to have to make. And honestly, both teams are not going to be happy with the decision. Whether it's probably going to be a 2-1 for either the neg or the AF. But I would have to say, take away from this, simplify the debate. It is not about how many arguments you can win. It's about what is the quality of the argument that you are winning. So with that said, I think it's time to wrap this up. If you want to sign up for our summer workshops, just check the website down below. And we're going to be doing this far more often with far more rounds. So if there are any suggestions about how this video played out, let me know. Also, if there's any round suggestions of other rounds that we could do a breakdown of, then just let us know in the comments section. And I think that, this was a lot of fun, but I think we're done now. So see you.